Eric Garner's death will not lead to federal charges for NYPD officer. 5 years after Mr. Barr ordered the case be dropped. Gwen Carr, Eric Garner's mother, 2014 death, credit. Demetrius Freeman for The New York Times. A politician within the death of Eric Garner ended on Tuesday after Attorney General William P. Barr ordered that the case be dropped. The United States Attorney in Brooklyn, Richard P. Donahue, announced the choice at some point before the 5th anniversary of Mr. Garner's death at the hands of cops on Staten Island. Prompted national protests over excessive force by the police. Garner, as he gasped, "I can't breathe," and his death was one among several fatal encounters between black people and therefore the police that catalyzed the national Black Lives Matter movement. His dying words became a rallying cry for demonstrations that led to changes in policing practices across the United States. The DOJ has failed us, Eric Garner's family assails prosecutors. July 16, 2019. Still, a Staten Island grand jury declined to indict Officer Daniel Pontalio, who was captured on a video wrapping his arm around Mr. Garner's neck. The federal civil rights investigation dragged on for 5 years amid internal disputes within the Department of Justice, under both President Barack Obama and President Trump. In the end, Mr. Barr made the decision to not seek a civil rights indictment against Officer Pontalio, just before a deadline for filing some charges expired. 5 years after Mr. Garner's dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry, the Department of Justice said it might not pursue charges against a replacement York City policeman. Listen to The Daily, a choice within the Eric Garner case. 5 years after Mr. Garner's dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry, the Department of Justice said it might not pursue charges against a replacement York City policeman. Michael Barbaro. From The New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This is The Daily. Today, the Department of Justice won't bring federal charges against the officer involved within the death of Eric Garner. Ashley Southall on why that decision was reached 5 years after "I Can't Breathe" became a national rallying cry. It's Wednesday, July 17. Ashley, tell me what happened on Tuesday. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. Good morning. Thank you for coming today. Ashley Southall. So the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, Richard Donahue, whose office is based in Brooklyn, but also oversees Staten Island, came out and said. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. Garner's death was a tragedy. For anyone to die under circumstances like these may be a tremendous loss. Ashley Southall. They've done an exhaustive review. They've checked out each piece of evidence, but. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. And therefore the evidence here doesn't support charging policeman Daniel Pontalio or the other officer with a federal criminal civil rights violation. Ashley Southall. That they might not bring charges against any of the officers involved in Eric Garner's death on July 17, 2014. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. We know and understand that some are going to be disappointed by this decision, but it's the conclusion that's compelled by the evidence and therefore the law. Ashley Southall. He's making this announcement at some point before the 5th anniversary of Eric Garner's death, which is vital, because for the charge that they thought was appropriate during this case, they only had 5 years to make a decision whether to bring it. Michael Barbaro. So this is often basically the last possible moment to bring this charge. Ashley Southall. Exactly. And at the top of the day, the prevailing consensus was that they might not do this during this case. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. Michael Barbaro. And remind us of the small print of this case, of what happened to Eric Garner, where this case begins. Ashley Southall. The case starts on July 17, 2014 on a hot summer day in Staten Island. The police say that a person by the name of Eric Garner has died during an effort to arrest him. There's no mention of any quite use of force, no mention of a chokehold. Then subsequent morning, the police and therefore the public awakened to the present video. Archived recording, Eric Garner. Every time you see me, you would like to mess with me. I'm uninterested in it. This stops today. Archived recording. This guy right here is forcibly trying to lock somebody up for ending a fight. Ashley Southall. And that they accuse him of selling cigarettes. And he says, "No, man, I'm not selling anything. I'm just minding my business. Leave me alone." Archived recording, Eric Garner. Everybody standing here. They'll tell you I didn't do nothing. I didn't sell nothing. Ashley Southall. This goes on for about 10 minutes. Archived recording Eric Garner. You want to harass me? You would like to prevent me? Ashley Southall. Officer D'Amico moves in to undertake to handcuff Eric Garner, and he flails his hands away. Then you've got Officer Pontalio attempt a takedown. They fall back to sheet glass. Archived recording. Hold on. Ashley Southall. Mr. Garner's 400 pounds. Officer Pontalio is perhaps another 190, 200. The glass goes to buckle. Garner prone and handcuff him. And other officers have received the scene by then. There are about 7 seconds once you see Officer Pontalio's arm around Eric Garner's neck. At some point, he releases, and Mr. Garner is saying. Archived recording Eric Garner. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Ashley Southall. He ultimately says it 11 times. Archived recording. Once again, police beating abreast of people. Ashley Southall. EMS eventually arrives. They don't have any oxygen. Archived recording, speaker 1. Look now, man, they gave this man a seizure. Archived recording, speaker 2. No, move out the way. No. Archived recording, speaker 3. It's my brother. We live here. Ashley Southall. Michael Barbaro. What happens within the aftermath of this video being released? Ashley Southall. So just about directly, there involves Officer Pontalio to be fired and for him and other officers to be criminally charged, both for Eric Garner's death but also for the omissions of the utilization of force from official reports. Michael Barbaro. Because until this video is released, the officers involved within the encounter, they haven't mentioned any of the tactics that they've used. Ashley Southall correct. Then 3 things happen simultaneously. The Police Internal Affairs Bureau begins looking into the incident to ascertain if any protocols were violated. At an equivalent time, the Staten Island DA is watching whether a criminal offense was committed, then begins to present evidence to a jury. And at an equivalent time, the feds also are looking in on these investigations, trying to ascertain what evidence there's. But at that moment, they're not yet investigating, because there's an area process that has got to play out. Michael Barbaro. And once you say the feds, you mean the Department of Justice. Ashley Southall. The Department of Justice. Michael Barbaro. So my sense is that this is often all moving as would be expected during a case like this. But what's different is that a month after this happens, Michael Brown is shot in Ferguson, and therefore the issue of how police treat unarmed Black Americans becomes a serious national issue. Ashley Southall. Correct. But it's a problem that's been bubbling up for a few time. If you'll reverse back to 2012, when Ramarley Graham was shot and killed by a replacement York City policeman, he was unarmed. Archived recording. Officer Richard Haste was indicted for manslaughter, but a judge reluctantly threw out the indictment in May on procedural grounds. Ashley Southall. Then, a couple of weeks later, you've got Trayvon Martin, who was killed by a vigilante in Florida. Archived recording. We have just learned that the jury has determined that Zimmerman isn't guilty of any crime. Ashley Southall. And then you've got Eric Garner in July 2014, followed by Michael Brown that August. Archived recording. The conclusion? That policeman Darren Wilson wasn't guilty of a criminal offense when he shot Michael Brown to death on August 9. Ashley Southall. And then you've got Akai Gurley and Tamir Rice within days of every other. Archived recording. A jury decided to not indict Timothy Loman, who shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Ashley Southall. So people are seeing this pattern of unarmed Black men and boys, and even some women, being killed by the police and nobody being held responsible or in charge of their deaths. Which is that the backdrop for the choice by the jury in Staten Island in December 2014 that there isn't enough evidence to prove that Officer Pontalio committed a criminal offense. Michael Barbaro. So just like the DOJ this week, the investigation by the Staten Island DA all the way back in 2014 finds that there's not sufficient evidence. Ashley Southall. Yes. And to the general public, that's infuriating. Because confined mind that within the months between Eric Garner's death in July and therefore the grand jury's decision in December, the general public has learned that the doctor, who may be a pathologist, deemed this a homicide. And that they also learned that for a minimum of 20 years, chokeholds are explicitly banned by the local department. And what people saw there on video was a politician employing a banned chokehold and Mr. Garner dying. Archived recording. Chanting, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe." Michael Barbaro. We'll be right back. And what can we realize how this jury decided to not press charges in what appeared to numerous, from the video, sort of a clear-cut case? Ashley Southall. One thing that the jury also heard that the general public didn't was testimony from Officer Pantaleo about what he intended to try to do. And he got up there ahead of them and said that it had been not his intent to use a chokehold. It had been not his intent to harm Mr. Garner or to kill him. It had been his intent to bring him down and effect an arrest as he had been ordered to try to do. Michael Barbaro. And that testimony, it seems like, becomes important, the question of intent. Ashley Southall. Yes, because the quality of proof during a criminal case is that the prosecutor must prove beyond an inexpensive doubt that the officer willfully acted in violation of the law, that it had been an officer's intent and his will to violate the law. And for that jury, the choice to not press charges indicates that the evidence didn't meet that standard. Michael Barbaro. And what about the very fact that the utilization of a chokehold had been banned by police, no matter intent? Didn't he use an illegal practice? And wasn't that weighed by the grand jury? Ashley Southall. What Officer Pantaleo told the Interior Affairs Bureau, and later the jury, was that he wasn't meaning to use a chokehold. He said he was trying to use a seat belt technique, which may be a tactic approved by the NYPD and taught at the academy. Michael Barbaro. It's another quite restraint? Ashley Southall. Yes. And what his lawyers have also acknowledged is that, whether it had been a safety belt or a chokehold, once they're on the bottom and Mr. Garner begins to grunt and say, "I can't breathe," he releases him. Michael Barbaro. So after the DA decides to not press charges, what happens to the case of Eric Garner? Ashley Southall. And once the local investigation is completed, it's now in their territory. Archived recording. Eric Holder. Good evening. I would like to supply an update regarding the case involving Eric Garner. Michael Barbaro. What are they looking at? Is it a replacement question, or are they basically investigating an equivalent things because the city? Ashley Southall. So what the jury in Staten Island was watching was whether Officer Pantaleo committed a criminal offense. Archived recording. Eric Holder. Now that the local investigation has concluded, I'm here to announce that the Department of Justice will proceed with a federal civil rights investigation into Mr. Garner's death. Ashley Southall. Here, the federal is watching whether his crime was violating Eric Garner's civil rights. Archived recording. Eric Holder. This afternoon, I spoke with the widow of Eric Garner to tell her and her family of our decision to research potential federal civil rights violations. Ashley Southall. And during this case, there have been two key things that they wanted to determine, or that they'd felt they needed to determine. One, that the force Officer Pantaleo want to subdue Mr. Garner was objectively unreasonable, that a policeman acting in those circumstances could have recognized what he did as just an excessive amount of. Then the second thing that they wanted to determine was that his conduct was a willful violation of the law, that he knew the law which he acted during a way that disregarded it. Michael Barbaro. And by those measures, did the Department of Justice feel that it had a robust case to bring against this officer? Ashley Southall. So this is often the question that they were asking themselves over the quite 4 years that they were investigating this incident. Then the prosecutors in Brooklyn, who were getting to be those who had to prosecute the case, who thought that it had been not winnable. Michael Barbaro. And what's your understanding of why those two sides disagreed? What was Washington thinking? And what was NY thinking? Ashley Southall. From what we all know, it really decreased to the willfulness. On the video, some prosecutors thought that the very fact that Officer Pantaleo kept his arm around Eric Garner's neck even after they were on the bottom showed that he willfully disregarded the law. In Brooklyn, they weren't so sure. And a part of that, you'll imagine, is from Officer Pantaleo's testimony that his intent wasn't to harm him. His intent was to arrest him. So all the while that prosecutors are conducting their investigation and handling these questions on whether or not they have a case and whether or not they can win it, we undergo a series of attorneys general, Eric Holder, Loretta Lynch, Jeff Sessions, who are all overseeing this case from Washington. Then you finish up with Bill Barr, our current Attorney General. Michael Barbaro. And the decision ultimately. Ashley Southall. The sequel to the next clip does not involve participation and support with like and comment.